Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from beautiful and albeit a little bit sleepy Washington, D.C. My name is Greg Rulifson, and I am a Sustainability Advisor and AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow in the Supply Chain Management Division, bear with me, of the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance within USAID. Thank you all being here for this fifth and penultimate webinar, Enhancing the Sustainability of Humanitarian Action in the series more broadly of Environment and Emergencies in the face of COVID-19. The previous four webinars have had excellent attendance in the thousands, I think, collectively, and just really impressive attendance. So thank you all for being here. And many more are going to continue to be watching those recordings, of course, as well. So I have the great honor and pleasure of being your moderator for the next 90 minutes. And thank you very, very much to the UNEP OCHA Joint Environment Unit for the invitation, and then the India National Institute for Disaster Management for co-hosting this webinar series, which has been excellent. I've joined in on many of them and listened to the others, so very impressed, and thank you very much. So as we get into it, let me just start here with some logistics. So just note that the webinar will be recorded and then available for all participants. Put your questions in the question box. The panelists and the organizers will reply in writing to the questions to the extent possible during the webinar, and the most recurrent questions, or the ones that have lots of interest, will be answered during the live Q&A session at the end. I think we have about 15-20 minutes for that, so stick around. So you can see here the broader program of the different webinars that we've had over since July. So this is the 5th of 6th for the year. You can walk yourself through the different ones. Today is Enhancing the Sustainability of Humanitarian Action. And before we get into the main event here, I just wanted to share very briefly a little bit about the collaborative work that we've been doing in the USAID Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. That wouldn't be possible without the continued partnership with UNEP and OCHA Joint Environment Unit, for many years of progress in environment and humanitarian action. So just very briefly, before we get into the really exciting stuff of our panelists, a little bit of context. So on the environmental performance of the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, I'm currently filling in for the Bureau Environmental Officer in this webinar, not as a job, who oversees all of our environmental activities. So we have our programs that are closer to the development end of the spectrum, and they require initial environmental examinations, climate risk management, and further environmental compliance practices, also known as, or in some organizations, as environmental safeguarding. So those things that I think we all think about as our environmental performance work in development more broadly. Increasingly though, and the reason that I'm here, is because we're applying that lens to operations. So I sit within the Supply Chain Management Division, and I'm proud to be the first to address environmental performance from that division. So we are catching up currently with many of our partners, such as WFP, including Emma Cataneo, who's going to be one of our panelists today, but then also the International Committee of the Red Cross. They're doing some excellent work in, for example, recycling in some of their refugee camps. So they've embedded sustainability experts throughout their operations, and we are in the beginning stages of that. So just real quickly, specifically for one project that we are working on is the Joint Initiative on Sustainable Humanitarian Packaging Waste Management. It's a mouthful, but it's something that I think we can grab onto, as we don't want to be leaving plastic and other kinds of trash at the sites where we have humanitarian operations. It's fairly simple and easy to grasp, but we are approaching it in a way that I hope you can appreciate. It's not too complex, but appropriately so. So we had two main elements here are around the collaboration and the approach being very collaborative, but then also a technical approach that really gets us outside of a linear way of thinking, or one that focuses on where the commodities are distributed, so that we have more opportunities to make an impact on our environmental performance. So just last week, we had USAID hosted with our partners, 15 different partners, over 40 participants, to address the #1 priority that was identified in the scoping study that we undertook over the last year or so, and that was enhanced humanitarian coordination. So throughout this 2 days, 4 hours each day, we talked about communications, coordination, and commitments through virtual blood, sweat, and tears, and it was interactive and action-oriented, and bringing those people together, even in a virtual space, was incredibly valuable, and we are moving forward on the beginnings of an action plan to really get us moving down the field on this work. So in the next 2 months, actually, we'll be coming out with some preliminary log frames, ways forward in these different areas, these technical areas. And so those are the other way that we're approaching this of policy, procurement, design and production, distribution, and then end-of-life management and reverse logistics to get any of that, what ends up being recyclable waste, those materials back. So these 5 areas, we are really excited that we've had great participation in all of them from our different partners, and now we're all going back into our respective organizations and continuing the collaboration, but also socializing these ideas even further. But I know that, for example, Emmanuel is going to talk more about what they've already done in WFP, and that I think that we're all, again, kind of catching up, but making sure that we're taking in those lessons learned in each of those areas, and making sure that, for example, within design and production of our packaging, that if we can reduce the amount of material for the same performance by, we get a 10% reduction in material, that is a big impact over our larger humanitarian assistance supply chain. So that is, I think, where I will leave it on our project that we're working on more broadly. We certainly have some exciting panelists here today, and again, it's an honor and a pleasure for me to be here as the moderator. So, excuse me. For an agenda of kind of the run of show for today, we have opening remarks by Victoria Saiz-Omenaca, the head of the office for OCHA Indonesia. Next, we will have humanitarian action and sustainability. Why? I like that question a lot. Mihir Bhatt, director of the All India Disaster Mitigation Institute. Then we'll have managing WFP's environmental footprint, some stories from the field by Emanuela Cataneo, regional environmental advisor at the World Food Program. And then our final, but certainly very important participant and panelist, climate change versus climate crisis versus data revolution, a battle of the giants, exactly how I would frame that as well. So really excited to hear from Hussein Suleiman, who's the UNEP National Consultant and Professor at the University of Gadarif in Sudan. And then finally, we'll have a question and answer. So again, stick around. Please use the question box to drop your questions in there, and we will get going on this excellent panel here. So thank you again, everybody, for attending, and I'm going to pass it off to Victoria.
Thank you very much, Greg, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's really my pleasure to be providing these opening remarks. I want to apologize because due to some technical difficulties, you won't be able to see my video, but hopefully you can hear me loud and clear, which is really what matters. I want to thank everyone for the tremendous interest that we have had in the events held so far. This is the 5th edition of the Global Webinar Series on Environment and Emergencies in the face of COVID-19. We've had more than 1,000 participants in each individual webinar, which is a strong sign of the demand that there is to learn more about the links between environment and humanitarian action. And although the last months have had COVID as the center of the public debate, I think it's important to keep in mind that we are in a climate emergency. We are at the beginning stages of a climate emergency. And this emergency is going to have a great impact on resource availability, resource competition, and in turn, it's very likely to generate tremendous displacement in different parts of the world. Displacement is already happening. In fact, we have staggering numbers. Currently, almost every second, one person becomes displaced due to a sudden onset disaster. And on average, 25 million people are being displaced every year. This is only when we take into account sudden onset disasters, such as, for example, typhoons, floods, storms. But the figures are actually much higher if we take into account people that are displaced due to slow onset disasters that are not as visible, but we know are happening, such as, for example, droughts, desertification, or rising levels of the sea. In fact, it is anticipated that there will be, or there will have to be planned relocation in years to come, particularly in island nations and areas that are very close to rising sea levels. These are reflected in the findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that compiles all the scientific evidence that is behind these facts. And I want to emphasize the same way that I think we're all looking at the vaccine for COVID-19 with a lot of hope. The same science that has allowed us to have a vaccine in record time is the science that is telling us what's coming our way in the next years, and we really need to listen to that. So it's very important that we acknowledge that there are environmental issues linked to humanitarian crisis and humanitarian emergencies, whether they're caused by natural disasters or complex emergencies. And this is something that we have not had traditionally in the radar. We don't typically think of environmental issues when we think of a humanitarian emergency. We need to change that, and we need to ensure that environmental considerations are included from the earliest stages of humanitarian action. And I'll give you an example from Indonesia, but it is an example in many other countries of the world. Indonesia is in the ring of fire. It's subject to natural disaster events. So very often earthquakes or flooding may disturb construction materials that contain substances that are harmful for the health of people, for example, asbestos or chemical materials. And when those are disturbed by a disaster event, by an earthquake, for example, and they are left out in the open, they will affect the health of people in the long term. And if we don't take those into account in a humanitarian response, as good as a humanitarian response immediately may be, we are not taking into account the effect or the long-term effect of that natural disaster event in the health of people. So we really need to incorporate that. And I want to emphasize 3 specific areas of work where we need to look at how to do this. The first one, as I mentioned, is to consider the environmental issues in any emergency response. The second one, we need to minimize the environmental impact of humanitarian action. Again, it's something we don't typically think about. What is the impact on the environment of the activities that we're conducting today? And the third one, we need to strengthen the adaptation to climate change, particularly those areas that are already confronted with humanitarian crisis. How do we take into account what we know is coming our way so that we can be better prepared? I want to refer to the COVID-19 pandemic because it is yet another reminder of how we need to take into account environmental issues. In Indonesia, for example, we have had more than 500,000 confirmed cases. We suspect that there may be more, of course. Every day we have about more than 3,000 new cases of infections confirmed. And Indonesia is also the highest death toll in Southeast Asia. Already in the early stages of the pandemic, and I'll give you an example from August. In August, we already had 4 times more health waste than before the pandemic. About 1,000 tons of medical waste were generated every day due to the pandemic. And despite the very important efforts by the government of Indonesia to issue regulations and guidelines in handling the waste, it's very difficult to control all the waste management companies. And we do know that often some of the regulations and guidelines have or are being violated, and waste is being dumped in many different places. Of course, with very negative impact for the environment and the health of people. So during the pandemic, medical waste has been found in landfills across the country. To give you an example, a search of medical waste accumulated in a landfill near Jakarta. The pressure of the amount of waste led to the landfill's wall collapsing, and about 100 tons of waste clogged 2/3 of a river that is 138 kilometers long. Already in March and April, about 60% of all the garbage that was floating in two of the rivers that end in the estuaries in Jakarta Bay, 16% of the total garbage was healthcare related garbage. How does this have an impact? Of course, it potentially may affect the number of infections, because it's possible that some of this garbage is still contaminated and it generates additional infections and the spread of the virus among people. But of course, it also has an impact on the flora and the fauna, and you know, such a beautiful country, it's greatly being affected. Maybe two other aspects of COVID-19 to be mentioned and that have an impact on the environment. The impact of disinfectants, chlorine, for example, is posing a rising pollution threat in many rivers. And that's something that is also being already seen in Indonesia. There is calls for studies to be done on how the levels of chlorine are affected the life that exists in those rivers right now. And of course, the use of single-use plastics has increased exponentially, and we do know that there is no easy way to dispose of those ones yet, and they end up in the rivers and the sea that surround us. These are just a few examples. I think in going forward, it's really important that we continue to work together to enhance the sustainability of humanitarian action. We need to, humanitarian actors, we need to engage and be part of the solution to the climate emergency. We need to think of how to do that. As I mentioned earlier, it's not something that we have traditionally done. But we need to make sure that humanitarian action integrates those issues, that is forward-looking, and that we are anticipatory. We need a change of mindset to make sure that all of these issues are considered and integrated as a standard practice. We do know that small adjustments can make a big, long-term positive impact, and that's where I'm very hopeful. We need champions of change at all levels to ensure that these concerns are integrated and addressed, and there's awareness about the impact. And only by doing that, we will be able to ensure humanitarian action that is not only effective and save lives, but is also sustainable and fit for purpose in an evolving way, in an evolving world. I don't want to take any more time. I know we have very interesting panelists, so thank you very much again for having me. I am looking forward to hearing from our fellow panelists. Thank you, Greg. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for those excellent remarks and reminding us of the importance of this more broadly. And just as a personal note, Indonesia is where I came into all of this work, I think, a number of years ago now, but working on tsunami and earthquake risk mitigation in Sumatra. So feeling those remarks very much, and can picture all of the places you're talking about. So thank you very much for those words. I think we'll go on to our first panelist, Mihir Bhatt. And here we go. So that, again, the director of the All India Disaster Mitigation Institute. So I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Rulifson, and Victoria Tarimakashi. Thank you very much. It was very good setting the scene to start the work. I've been requested by the organizers, so the USAID and UNEP, OCHA, to talk about the humanitarian action and sustainability and give some insights from India. And what I'm going to do is look at humanitarian action, both in terms of what happens during the action, but also what happens subsequently. So action doesn't sort of cut, and that's a perspective I'm taking. And sustainability, I'm going to look at more from the environmental and ecological aspect of that than many other, quite important, but many other sustainability aspects that we may want to look at some other time. And the insights, we could bring it in various places. I'm going to bring insights from 4 or 5 major, innovative, and forward-looking initiatives that are going on in and around India, from which what the insight is. And the government of India has done a lot of work to bring together these 2 aspects of humanitarian action and sustainability, and that work is ongoing, and someday we'll talk about that. And also the UN system is very much aware of that within the country to take this action further. So I thought I'll take the discussion further and see what are the emerging areas where this particular aspect of overlap between humanitarian action and sustainability is taking place. And feel free to post your questions if I have missed out on anything. One of the first thing I would like to talk about is this new concept which is being put together based on the reality, and that is the cascading uncertainties. Next slide, please. Cascading uncertainties. And I'll take an example of 2 recent cyclones, Cyclone Nisarga to 2020 and Cyclone Amphan, which recently visited Indian coast. And what is happening, and there is a very good blog by Shilpi Srivastava and Laila Mehta on this cascading uncertainties, that we have not only one uncertainty related to the disaster risk, but several of them overlap and cascade. And in these 2 cases, we had floods already taking place in Nisarga, that is the Bombay area, and in Amphan, which is the West Bengal area, also part of Bangladesh as well. And on the floods, we had again uncertainty, and therefore the disaster risk coming out from the cyclones that came to these 2 areas. And on top of it, as we know, these areas were already affected by the pandemic. So you had several uncertainties and risks overlapping simultaneously. And this is not, I'm sorry to report, but going to be a one-off event. This is going to happen more and more, this cascading uncertainty. And within that, if that is what happens, and if our humanitarian response to cascading uncertainties remain unsustainable or not ecosystem-based or not really caring about the long-term environmental impact of our actions, we are going to have multiple disadvantages or negative impact on the local environment, local ecology, so on and so forth. So one thing which will accelerate the need for cascading, sustainability is the cascading uncertainties that we are going to face. And that's the first point I'd like to make. Second point I'd like to make is that work that is being done in Kerala by the Kerala State Disaster Management Authority, very important state of India, and Kutumbashree, which is a large semi-government social organization providing livelihoods to low-income women all across the state, millions of them. And the study was done by the Harvard FXB Center and 5,000 families. And they set up what is called panel studies. And this panel study, you can, next slide, please. And this panel study, as you can see, the third item, Kerala floods 2018, is looking at that how the humanitarian action related impact unfolds over the years. So after 2 years, after 4 years, after 8 years, and when we see things over a period of time, we actually find that the sustainability, which may seem very real in the first 2 years, is actually not, and things which we thought were not sustainable in the short run actually becomes sustainable in the long run. So that's what the third item on the slide that you see is telling us. The second item, Indian Ocean tsunami, and there was a large coalition which was supported by USAID, all the UN agencies, major donors around, to joint evaluation of tsunami impact. And one of the things which came out very clearly from that, and that we see recently, when after the first 10 years I revisited the same sites to see the same areas, is that the sustainability considerations, when they were missing from the humanitarian action in the first 3 months, 9 months, and 18 months, you saw them coming out quite clearly in terms of energy issues, solid waste management issues, issues of ecological damage, for example, so on and so forth. So that's something on Indian Ocean tsunami, and it again shows that if systematic panel studies are done or time-lapse studies are done, we will see how sustainability becomes even more important than the humanitarian action per se. And if we go even further down 20 years and look at Gujarat earthquake, and we were involved in doing the DEC, Disaster Emergency Committee evaluation, and we, after 20 years, when we revisited that, we found again that the sustainability concerns related to shelter, for example, education, for example, social protection culture, cluster, for example, become far more important over a period of time than during immediately after that. We had worked on that during the World Food Program, on that to see how the food security be made sustainable over a long run, and some measures taken by government of Gujarat then. Actually, you see that how those small sustainability related measures in terms of food and nutrition has made a greater impact in the long run. At that time, it seemed something not very much part of humanitarian action. So that's the importance that we see from the panel studies, that why sustainability is so important in the humanitarian action in India. I think in many other places as well. Next slide, please. There is a major study for years being done by ALNAP, Active Learning Network, and which is called State of Humanitarian System Study. And the latest study of 2019, which was a fantastic study, and we took it upon ourselves as All India Disaster Mitigation Institute, with, of course, UNICEF and World Food Program as partners, Sphere as partners, Save the Children was our partner, to do a Delhi consultation at a national level, that what does the state of humanitarian system tell us? And subsequently, we also went further down at a state level, subnational level, to see that this humanitarian system, how, what the findings are, what is it at a subnational level that we are finding out. And it very clearly, all the discussions very clearly talked about what is called accountability to affected environment. There is so much idea of accountability to human beings, authorities, donors, but the affected environment is something which is not talked about. I very distinctly remember we were in Assam, and a very vocal civil society leader, Mrinal, pointed out that we always think about humans and their loss of life, and sometimes their loss of livelihood, but what happens to non-humans? And that we don't look at very carefully at all in our humanitarian need assessment, impact assessment, so on and so forth. So that was something very clearly came out, to look at accountability of affected environment during and after the humanitarian action. Next slide, please. Recently, the IFRC was very thoughtful to have a major gathering, which was called Climate Red. and there was a very special session organized by a small group, which was called, and the session was called, "We Need a Bigger Boat." And the idea was that the climate change related crises are increasing, and we can see in the US the wildfire that is happening there, and the sea level rise and possible displacement and more number of cyclones. So climate change related events would cause much larger humanitarian crises than we have dealt with before, number one, and they would be in many areas simultaneously. So sometimes we are able to respond if there are floods in Bangladesh, India can respond, Myanmar can respond, of course people from Europe and USA can come. But when there are simultaneous floods in a large parts of different parts of the world, how do we respond? And we need much larger, much well-organized effort to respond to that. And in that discussion, which was very fascinating, what came up was again underlining the need that these kind of bigger boats, larger responses, needs to look at sustainability aspects so that these large response don't end up having huge environmental cost, huge ecological cost, and actually doing more harm than the support that they have done in the short run. Long term, more harm. So that is something that was very actively discussed, and that is something where India is picking up, that how do we reduce, well, how do we first be prepared for that, and second, reduce the negative impact of the environmental crisis related humanitarian response. Next slide, please. This is the third area where a lot of work is done by Hans and Lars from IDS Sussex, and we are in India also working with them to look at what is called the marginal environments. And at some point, these were the environments which are very central and very important to the ecology, to the economy, to the employment, and for over a period of time, they have become the marginal environments. And these are the three examples: deserts of the region of Kutch, then the delta of Sundarbans in India and also in Bangladesh, and the coastal metro city of Mumbai. And the study, which is ongoing for last 3 years, 4 years, looking at the uncertainty, transformation, and now sustainability, that how do we have sustainability there. And there what we are finding, that the way to sustainability or transformation to sustainability in this ongoing work are based on at least a couple of things we know quite for sure. And one of that is the co-production, that no single agency or no group of single agencies can actually go forward to do this. There needs to be co-produced. The results, the actions that we do needs to be done jointly by a large number of agencies and communities. So top, middle, and bottom, all three need to respond simultaneously. So that is something coming out from the marginal environment related work that is happening in India. Very fascinating. Next slide, and that's the last one that we have. I'd like to suggest the way ahead that is coming out from these 4 or 5 areas that I discussed. And first and most important finding emerging is that the economy as we have in India, in the world, is not going to let us go beyond marginal changes in sustainability. If we are looking for major changes, 2% reduction on emission, there has to be major changes, and this economy will not actually deliver. What we need is a transformed economy, which is called economy of nurturance. And if the humanitarian action takes place in the economy of nurturance, vis-a-vis economy of neoliberal economics, we are not going to have the results that we find. So that's the first way ahead, that how do we find economy of nurturance within which humanitarian action actually takes place, and humanitarian action, how does it build economy of nurturance as a long-term recovery when it unfolds. So that's one. Second is the great importance of lateral learning or lateral joint working together, South-South work which of course UNEP does, OCHA does, WFP does, and should be done more, because there's a lot of experience all across the world where if you put it together, there is fair amount of good, substantial, robust material that we have to turn humanitarian action far more sustainable than it has been so far. And for that, South-South cooperation, lateral cooperation is very important. So that's a second way ahead I'd like to suggest. And third one, which again is not new, but I'd like to underline, is a green humanitarianism or clean humanitarianism. And there we would like to, I would like to suggest what is coming out from the work that I have just described is that far more center stage, what I would say, what is happening to non-human species and what is happening to natural resources. And that's something we cannot overlook anymore. The other day I was talking to my son, who was pointing out to me, based on some of the readings, that if human beings were not there on the earth, it may be a humanitarian crisis, but the planet will continue. But he said, if the bees were not in the world, we all will die, the whole world will die. And I can't forget that. So I think we are very Anthropocene, but we need to see that we are part of a larger system and place ourselves there. So I think green, clean humanitarianism would be good. And I'd like to end by suggesting that maybe the Joint Environment Unit may want to look at a meta review of various initiatives that are being done all across the globe, top level, medium level, local level, and see what is it that it is telling us. It may take a year or two to actually do that, but that would be a major contribution for this series of webinars that are taking place. Thank you very much, and all the questions later on during the question answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those thoughtful remarks. I think there's a lot of that language that's really resonating that you provided there, in addition to the excellent example. So thank you, Mihir, for providing us with some more work to build on, and a good recommendation, I think. But that's definitely not I can't speak for the JEU. So I think next we are going to pass it over to Emanuela Cataneo, and she is going to share some stories from the field. And I'd just like to say thank you, Emanuela, for participating in the workshop last week and contributing to our end-of-life management breakout group that I think really benefited from these stories from the field, and that we don't have nearly enough of them. And I think this is part of what Mihir was getting at about having some of the South-South collaboration, but also that we need to get out there and get those stories and get as many people involved as possible. So Emanuela Cataneo, Regional Environmental Advisor at the World Food Program, hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg, and thank you all for participating. It's yeah, I hope I can give you some examples of best practices and bad practices that we can all work to implement for more sustainable humanitarian action. Next slide, please. So I'll start by giving you a bit of background of the size of WFP operations, so that you can really put into context the scale and type of environmental challenges we face. WFP is assisting 97 million people in 88 countries, delivering 15 billion food rations every year, equivalent to 4.2 million metric tons. In addition to in-kind assistance, WFP also provided 2.1 billion USD of cash and vouchers. And its staff, we have 20,000 staff worldwide, based in 14,000 premises. And as you can see, they're mostly located in the global south. So while delivering life-saving work, we also recognize that our actions can have unintended environmental impacts. And this can hamper the effectiveness of the relief we bring, of the recovery, and the sustainable development efforts. Next slide. I don't know how many of you are familiar with these kind of pictures, but unfortunately they are very common in the backyard of our compound. And these are not all WFP sites. So we really share the same environmental challenges with all humanitarian actors. From left to right, these pictures represent the flip of the coin of humanitarian action, as Victoria was saying. Water leakages in extremely water-stressed areas, piles of waste being burned openly, huge diesel generators to provide power, hazardous waste engine oil just spilling on the ground and awaiting safe disposal. Basically, the humanitarian community got a free ticket and is still mostly turning a blind eye to the impact of our activities. Next. Now, a little bit on the positive side, there are examples of virtuous behavior within the humanitarian community, and I'd like to mention some of them and some of the policy initiatives that WFP have created and are creating an enabling environment for sustainability intervention. At UN level, last year, the Strategy for Sustainability Management in the UN System 2020-2030 was approved, and that's an overarching document to integrate environmental and social sustainability considerations across the UN's work in a systematic and coherent way. So really practicing the principle that the UN promotes and leaving a positive legacy. We're currently in the phase 1 of the strategy, which focuses on operations management, and there will be a phase 2 on programmatic activities that's currently being developed. Similarly, WFP has also recognized through its environmental policy the commitment to systematically identify, avoid, and manage the risks to the environment from our activities. And to implement this policy, it has established three key policy tools. These are environmental and social standards and screening for program activities that aim at safeguarding from unintended harm, and an environmental management system, which helps us improving the environmental performance of support operations in the areas of energy, waste, water, sustainable procurement, awareness, and training. Next slide. So what are we talking about in practice? I'd like to start with energy. WFP has two main financing mechanisms that support energy interventions, and they are absolutely key to implement energy projects. The first one is the Energy Efficiency Program, EEP. That's an internal grant system that part funds up to 50% of the WFP country office energy efficiency upgrades and renewable projects. As of September 2019, the total grant amount is nearly $1 million. And the typical interventions are energy efficient and solar lighting and appliances, equipment, standalone and grid-tied PVC photovoltaic systems. The second mechanism is the Capital Budgeting Facility, which is an interest-free loan provided to the WFP country offices, again, for the implementation of infrastructural projects, which include energy upgrades. Next, please. An example here of an energy project recently implemented is a multi-site solar project in Sudan, where WFP Engineering has installed solar powered systems with microgrids and inverter solutions in 17 warehouses. The reason for implementing the project is that all of these are remote locations where there's a lack of or there are expensive fuel and unreliable electricity system. So far, 8 of the sites have been commissioned, and the system sizes range from 25 kilowatt peak to 120 kilowatt peak installed capacity, and the total expected installed capacity at the end of the project will be 350 kilowatt peak. The project is innovative because it uses microgrid controllers that coordinate and optimize multiple power sources and loads. It also uses a combination of lithium-ion and supercapacitor energy storage, and both of them have longer lifespan and wider operating temperatures compared to older lead-acid batteries. And it also has a smart monitoring system that enables high-quality data collection and decision-making. Next, please. Another area of work where we're really active is supply chain, and we're progressively identifying sustainability impacts and developing solutions as much as we can along the entire supply chain. So some examples at the sourcing and packaging stage, also mentioned by Greg. In 2019, 25% of WFP's palm oil came from sustainable sources, and the target is to keep increasing the percentage as we go. There was a switch from bleached cartons to untreated ones, and it's interesting to think how small actions like this one, design actions, can actually have a huge energy impact, a huge impact in terms of energy reduction, CO2 and chlorine emission savings. At the same time, we are updating packaging specs across the board and branding and design, including exploring alternative materials. And again, I want to stress the work, the collaboration done with USAID in improving our packaging and ensuring that it's fit for purpose. On the impact, on the sustainability impact of delivery, while we change slide, I'd like to show you an example from South Sudan, so we can move to the new slide. Okay, what you see on the left-hand side is the graph of the combined carbon footprint of WFP from multiple sources. And you'll see that the blue category, which corresponds to WFP Aviation and the UNHAS, the Humanitarian Air Service, has increased significantly in 2014. This is just after the start of the South Sudan civil war in 2013, when basically WFP had to ramp up systems delivered by air, so that's essentially airdrops. This has had a huge impact on the overall carbon footprint of WFP. And the decrease you are seeing in more recent years is also partly due to some activities that the supply chain team have implemented in terms of prepositioning of food commodities, road rehabilitation, alternative transport modalities, so not planes, but other type of less polluting vehicles, as well as initiatives within aviation, for instance, to improve aircraft utilization rates, to reduce CO2 per passenger, and use more efficient aircraft. So what we see here really, and the data speaks very clearly, is that activities that help us reducing emission very often also generate economic benefits, long-term economic benefits. So all of this effort that has been put in place by supply chain that resulted in overall cost savings down the line. So of course, there is still a huge space for improvement. If you look, for instance, at the fuel and electricity consumption data, but definitely these are steps in the right direction. Next, please. Some examples of downstream waste management initiatives. I think some of you by now will be familiar with this slide. There are initiatives ongoing in East Africa and on recycling of used packaging. So the Kenya country office and the Ethiopia country office have managed respectively to recycle 1 million waste polypropylene woven bags and 9,000 plastic pallets into new products, useful products for the local market. These are ongoing initiatives. So once the system is up, we make sure that we keep recycling these materials and giving them a second life. Although these particular activities have generated economic benefits for WFP, however, we definitely have to acknowledge that many waste management solutions, when done properly, will actually cost us some money, but that's not a reason for not engaging in managing our impact. Next, please. We've, as mentioned by Victoria, we've also recently had to deal with one of the less visible impacts of COVID-19. That's the sudden generation of high volumes of potentially infective waste from used PPE, personal protective equipment. This is a major challenge, especially in countries that lack the adequate infrastructure to deal with this kind of waste. And we had to come up with waste management guidelines that are solid from a health perspective, but also implementable in field context. And we had a tremendous help really from experts in UN Environment, Peacekeeping, and WHO, who have helped us to develop a set of guidelines for safe management of PPE that is used in the typical WFP operation. So we're not talking of patient care situations, but our own field offices and warehouses. And the guideline provides basically a hierarchy of solutions that are based on the local context. So country offices can decide based on their local context which solution to implement for all the steps. So from segregation of waste through storage, collection, handling, and disposal. And they set out best practice to a least desirable option that at least ensure that we don't dispose of them in the worst possible way. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that in some locations we need to implement some last resort options, and we're trialing small portable incinerators that have an air induction system, especially in locations where there is a risk of waste pickers, so we can't simply landfill PPE. And this clearly is not the best solution, but at the same time, it's a significant improvement to open burning in terms of air pollution impact. So we hope that for some operations, it will be an incremental step towards achieving higher sustainability. Next, please. It's clear for us while setting up these projects that we really can't do it on our own. We need to work even closer with our partners and stakeholders, private sector, academic partners, to really achieve economies of scale and implement more impactful projects that in turn can generate more benefits at a lower cost. Some of the examples given here on the slide are of ongoing collaborations. For example, what Greg was mentioning, the joint initiative. It is really a mouthful for sustainable humanitarian packaging waste management, the JI, led by USAID, the environmental sustainability in humanitarian logistics, partnership for global action, led by the logistics cluster, as well as the very important support that we get in terms of technical capacity deployed through standby partners, for instance, funded by MSB, the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, and many others really that I don't have the time to mention, but that are really helping us to achieve more gains in enhancing the sustainability of other operations. It's also very important for us to participate to communities of experts like you all online to share expertise and resources. Next, please. So to sum up, a few key messages to sum up what I said until now is really that I'd like to highlight. First is that humanitarian actors need to take responsibility for their environmental footprint, and we need to start acting now and acting urgently to reduce the environmental degradation, and that's really to ensure that we're not harming the beneficiaries that we're trying to help. Secondly, it's important to rethink processes along the entire supply chain. So to act upstream in terms of sustainable sourcing and sustainable packaging during the delivery to reduce the CO2 emissions, during storage and post-harvest phases, as well as downstream, so waste management. Another point is that data enables informed decision making, and we should focus on innovative solutions that are, however, suitable for local context. So affordable, low tech, and easy to maintain, and at the same time, as much as possible, scalable and replicable. And possibly we should try and find solutions that address multiple environmental challenges at the same time and generate environmental, economic, and social co-benefits. And I think this one is really the big challenge for the humanitarian community, is not to present sustainability as a trade-off with our life-saving and life-changing work, but as integrated in it. And lastly, again, I can't stress enough how important it is to cooperate across sectors, across organizations, and to think outside the box in the sense of focusing on redesigning approaches, systems, and all processes that we've been implementing for the past years, and not really ask ourselves if they are still fit for purpose in today's world. Thanks, that will be it, and over to you, Greg.
Thank you very much, Emanuela, for all of those examples, and I think giving us a lot to chew on. Again, seems like you've made a lot of excellent progress, and the partnership and that collaboration going forward, I think is the way to go in our, green humanitarianism, to pull one from Mihir's presentation. So just as a reminder, put your questions, those of you in the audience, put those questions into the question box. We'll be taking them, so after each presentation, feel free to do that, and then we'll be taking the questions from that you put in the question and answer, or the question session in the last session of the day. So I think next we're going to move on to Hussein Suleiman. Go to the next slide. Excellent. So talking about climate vulnerability assessment for targeted humanitarian sites in Sudan, and this idea of the giants of data and climate. Very excited to hear what Hussein has to share with us. So I'll pass it over to him.
Thank you, Greg. As you said, I will talk about climate vulnerability for some selected areas in Sudan. And this work is part of the Adaptation to Climate Change in Sub-Saharan African project. The project is targeting humanitarian situations in some selected countries. It is through the International Climate Initiative. Next slide, please. Thank you. As we see that we have a map showing the area most at risk from climate change in Africa, and this project is situated in some of the countries in this zone, and the objective is to strengthen the capacity for climate change and adaptation on this in this large zone. And the motivation is how can we support those hotspots of humanitarian sites with updated information that can support and improve the capacity of organization working in this area. And the targeted communities are displaced and refugees communities in this area, including the host community. All of them are included at the targeted area for this project. Next slide, please. Within the sub-Saharan Africa, the project is currently working in 3 countries, Chad, Burundi, and Sudan, with a wide range of partners and organizations, including not only UN organizations, but other local organizations working in these areas. And in Sudan, the project is targeting 2 states where there is a real need for updated information about climate change, so that can support the implemented activities by the project. And the 2 selected areas, one is located in Greater Darfur, and it is East Darfur state, and it has a border with South Sudan, and the targeted community are refugees coming from South Sudan, including the internally displaced people from the conflict in Darfur. And in White Nile, most of we can say that all the target people are coming from South Sudan, and both states, as we see from the map, they had a long border with South Sudan. Next slide, please. The method developed for this work is mainly based on remote sensing techniques for many reasons, because of the scarce data and not available on the ground, and at the same time the issue of COVID-19, and we have to do this work remotely. And we have 2 scales for this study. We have regional scale, where we try to investigate some climate parameters working at that level, like rainfall, temperature, and vegetation. And at local scale, we focus more on areas around the camps and villages and cities where the refugees are hosted, including their host community. And also we try to look at the local scale, we try to look on something like land use and cover change before the arrival of the refugees. And after that, what is the situation and what things are being changed and how can we improve the situation. And also we try to detect some standing water bodies using some recent techniques of remote sensing to see if there is some danger or emergency that could be needed or should be managed by flood in this area. And based on this long time series, we try to develop some kind of indicators based on variabilities for the parameter that have been selected for this assessment. And the historical record for the data is for the last 39 years. So that around 40 years that could be used, and we try to use the mean, annual, and monthly, including the coefficient of variation of the inter and intra-annual climate parameter that has been selected. And we use remote sensing data from open sources, and open domains that are available from different sources, and this help us a lot actually to overcome the issue of lack of data. And I think using all these parameters, we expose the target area and to see the climate related stresses and the potential impact of the climate risk and vulnerability in both selected humanitarian area in White Nile and also in East Darfur. Next slide, please. Here I would like to show some finding containing the regional scale analysis. In terms of temperature, the area is located, the both selected area are located in the dune where there is no real change in terms of temperature, annual or monthly temperature. Month to month and also from year to year. And the 2 graphs gives us example that we have relatively short rainy season. East Darfur receives more rainfall compared to White Nile, but at the same time the variability of rainfall in White Nile is very
Saying if you can hear us, we're having some trouble with your audio.
high compared to East Darfur, and I think generating such information is very important for when we have high data. We should be more prepared. About the rainy season, especially that agriculture and livestock raiding are the main thing on.
All right, hang tight, folks. I think our audio quality is cutting out on us a bit from where Hussein is trying to do his presentation. For the moment, just because it keeps cutting back in, in and out. Take in the slide. I think there's a lot of good content there for the moment. Yeah. So what I think we're going to do next is just to try to get that audio so we get a consistent message from Hussein to walk us through. I think this really interesting and important research is that we're going to get into the questions. We have a couple for Mihir and we have some for Manuela. And then hopefully we'll be able to get the audio back to hear the rest from Hussein and to get some of those questions answered from him as well. So are we ready? Can get a thumbs up from Manuel and Mihir. Right.
So, but now I'm back again.
Oh, let's see. Hussein, are you back? Okay. I think what we're gonna do is jump into the question and answer, and then come back to Hussein's presentation. So Mihir, first one's gonna be for you. That's all right.
Yes.
So
yes, I'm back. If you give me like just the last three.
I think it's that delay that we have. All right. I think we're going to go for the questions here, and I think we'll figure it out. So first question for you, Mihir. Is there any method that can be implemented to dodge a storm or a cyclone back into the sea without hitting the coast?
Well, I'm not a bit of a dodger in any sense of the word personally, and I think we are talking about the ecosystem-based approaches as much as possible in a given condition. So I don't think it would be a good idea to dodge a cyclone back to sea or anywhere else. And I'm not aware of dodging cyclone back to sea. Are there any methods, technological or other, to do that? I can imagine possible ways of doing it, and there is some work is done not to dodge, but sort of guide to an extent, sort of a gentle, so that it doesn't land exactly where you think it's going to land and cause major catastrophe, such as a nuclear power station perhaps or something. But we don't really know if it has worked, if it has should we go ahead? So I think perhaps at this stage not to count too much on dodging a cyclone, or for that matter, floods as well. Thank you.
A couple more for you that I think we're going to run through just to keep the thread and remembering what your presentation was. So do you see any pushback on any past environmental gains during the COVID-19 pandemic? And if so, which ones? And maybe this is one for all of us, I think, but this is directed to Mihir.
Yeah, I think there has been a pushback almost on every aspect of environmental gains that we've made. It would be unfair to say that any aspect is left out. Some aspects are more affected than others. And I think this pushback is more out of not being prepared for such an overwhelming humanitarian crisis, which is global. And therefore, in India, you see a lot of effort being done by UN agencies and the government to make sure that, for example, disposing the vaccine-related all sorts of, or virus-related all sorts of material, and that's a major issue. Where do you dump them, and how do you dump them, and how long does it last, so on and so forth. So I think that disposable or solid waste management is perhaps which is worst affected, a pushback gains on that. And second is water, because wash hands and everything that needs to be washed, and where does that washed water goes, and where does it mix together. There are some precautions being taken there, but we don't really know. It's a very short time to actually have any sort of a judgment on that. But the real-time information says that these are the two possible areas where we need to look at more carefully. Thank you.
Yeah, and we've just got one more for you. So, and this is particular to India, which I think it gives us such some perspective on many other places and the applications. But so how do you see India moving forward towards green recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and the related economic trade-offs?
We have a National Disaster Management Authority which is empowered to take actions related to humanitarian crisis risk reduction and some of the related areas such as heat wave, for example, as well. So that authority I see playing far more active role in coming months and to guide the country ahead in terms of the COVID-19 related recovery being more sustainable, environmentally more sustainable, but also any other recovery that we may have in future. So I see that. There is also National Disaster Management, NIDM, National Disaster Management Institute of Government of India in Delhi, and which has done a lot of work on environmental aspects and has very good faculty and director there. And they have started thinking about what are the possible ways of making our recovery far more green and clean. To do that, I see one of the first steps we need to take is to take some sort of a stock to see that what's the baselines post first 8 or 9 months of COVID-19. And I understand that UNEP India has been quite concerned about that, and so is IUCN, which again has been looking at what this impact has been. Some very good work is done by US-based NRDC to look at the overlap between clean air and the spread of virus as well, to do that. So I think there are sort of pieces there, and perhaps the first step would be to have some sort of an overview of what's the baseline as far as the greening of the recovery is concerned, and second, what the target is. Thank you.
Right, excellent. Thank you for all of those great responses. I think if we actually have a question for Victoria. Victoria, are you on? Are you there?
Yes, Greg, very much here.
All right, perfect. So it's particular to Indonesia. What are the main enablers and the main challenges in Indonesia for uptake of environmental sustainability considerations by humanitarians?
Thank you, Greg, and thank you for the question. It's a really excellent question, and we ourselves have been reflecting a lot on that because it's really important to know what are the challenges that we're facing, as well as the advantages that we can draw on in ensuring sustainability of humanitarian action. In terms of enablers, there's been a lot of good traction and actually increased awareness by the government on the importance of environmental issues in disaster response. UN agencies as well as NGOs are also active. IFRC in particular, leading the shelter cluster, has taken a very important role in the last earthquakes in the country. So their active engagement is a big advantage. Indonesia has a very vibrant civil society. The number of youth organizations and volunteer movements and civil society organizations is really incredible. And I think they are also acting as a catalyst. The awareness is increasing. I always say youth are a big hope in terms of climate change and environmental action, because they come with a different mindset and very much aware of the issues. And I think they're becoming a catalyst for change. I think it's also very important that we document the impact of environmental issues as they relate to humanitarian action, right? And for example, in the last big earthquake in Indonesia, which was the central Sulawesi one, and before that, the earthquake in Lombok, there's been studies being undertaken now on the environmental impact of those earthquakes. I mentioned during my opening remarks that, you know, construction materials, when they fall apart due to an earthquake, can become dangerous for health if they release some toxic components in the air, or people live near or around them, or maybe even build the new housing on top of the rubble, right? So conducting those studies, collecting the data on the impact that may have on people's health is very important, because the more actual factual information that we have that we can use to make a case, the better. And there's been a lot of that happening. So that's all, I think, good and gives a lot of hope. In terms of the challenges, I will say probably the biggest challenge is, you know, Indonesia is a middle-income country. It's growing very rapidly. It's developing very fast. This rapid development draws on, you know, currently available technology and materials that are not necessarily always environmentally conscious. Trying to change that is not always easy, and we've seen that in other countries as well. I will also add as a challenge the opposite of what I used as an advantage. We don't have enough data yet to document the impact of some of these environmental issues on people's health. It's definitely an issue of more than, you know, just having garbage in rivers. These issues have an effect on people's health and the long-term sustainability of our lives in the communities in which we live, and we need to document that better. And that's a challenge. It requires money, it requires resources, and it requires time. So I hope this is useful. Over back to you, Greg.
Very useful, absolutely. Thank you for all of those responses. I think that gives us a picture, certainly for Indonesia, but in a lot of other programs as well. I think we'll, and for just an update, that we are still working on the audio from Hussein. Unfortunately, it's close to finishing, but yeah, I don't think we're going to get to hear the rest of his presentation. We're really hoping to get him back for some of your excellent questions. So I'm going to pose a couple of them to Manuela. So, let's see, the first one, what are the tools and applications to calculate, model, or estimate ecological footprint, biocapacity, and carbon footprint? And just noting that we're a bit short on time, and that is a large question, so as you will.
I'll start by saying that I can address the carbon footprint side of the question and not the other two at this stage. But simply put, the method the WFP follows is based on the greenhouse gas protocol that basically tells you what emission sources you have to measure and estimate because you have control of them. In our case, it's the aviation, it's the commercial travel, vehicles, and buildings. And then with the help of a facilities management software, we calculate how much of the fuel consumption, how much emissions it generates. Our system is now quite sophisticated because we've been working on it for the past 10 years. But ideally, if you have a right methodology, so if you're doing it in a scientific, solid way, you can potentially do it very easily with an Excel spreadsheet. So you start counting all your generators, how much liters per year, and borrow emission factors from reputable sources. And like this, you have at least an idea, an estimate of the footprint, and then you can add more sources, emission sources to it as the more you become advanced. I'm very happy also to address these questions separately. We have a whole team in our team that deals with this, so we can discuss them bilaterally in more detail. Over to you, Greg.
Thank you. I'm jealous of your team, I must say, and we are quickly getting that kind of capacity. So that's great. A quick one: what was the alternative selected for the polypropylene bags?
Yes, so at present there is no alternative selected. I want to really stress the fact that the most important thing for the packaging of humanitarian food is that the packaging preserves the food quality throughout a very complex and long supply chain. So there are no trade-offs here. The first and most important aspect is that the packaging is fit for purpose in terms of quality of what it contains. However, we are exploring for sure alternatives to our traditional packaging, as long as they meet the same characteristics so that we can use it without wasting any of the food that is inside the packaging, which would be a really huge loss. In specifically what's going on at WFP level is a partnership between ICRC, UNHCR, and WFP, funded by Innovation Norway, and that's a proposal to design, field test, and scale up alternative materials to polypropylene bags. The work is just starting, but we will be looking certainly at a range of materials and their properties and how they interact and how they behave in our very complex supply chain. Over.
And a quick follow-up, are you considering different materials based on different contexts and the locations as well? Is that part of the investigation, do you think? Yes.
Again, this work is led by our packaging expert, Carol Manso, but with whom our team collaborates closely. One example I'd like to give is on, for instance, bio-based materials, because everyone is now talking about using bio-based materials. Why is WFP not using bio-based materials? We don't only have to think about, as I said, the properties of the material itself and whether it's fit for our supply chain, but also, for instance, if it can be actually composted in the location where it's going. A lot of these bio-based materials are actually require industrialized composting facilities. So we need to make sure that the place where we're sending it has those facilities. Otherwise, again, it's the same as having polypropylene packaging. So that, Greg, to answer you, yes, it is certainly a deep diversified approach.
Great, thank you. So one more for you and then we have some questions that are kind of for anybody. We'll just have a few minutes left here for the question and answer. So I think this is one that resonates quite a bit. So how would you ensure supply chain sustainability when you have small firms as your supply chain partners with lesser resources?
That's an interesting one, and I want to clarify that my approach. I'm based in Kenya, so I also have I can understand that sometimes supply chain suppliers capacity in some parts of the world are very different. So where we may identify as a perfect and very sustainable solution is not actually implementable in other contexts. So in my experience, what's really key is to work with your suppliers to progressively and incrementally enhance their standards. So because if we want to move the whole industry a step forward in sustainability, we have to start by ourselves asking the suppliers to be more sustainable. And I'll give the example I can give is when we were trying to procure energy efficient air conditioners in Kenya 2 or 3 years ago, I don't remember exactly, but the local market wasn't able to supply what our specifications we had. So, but what was interesting to see is that over the course of the last 3 years, because we've been clear with our suppliers, local suppliers, that we wanted to purchase only those ACs, we were not going to purchase any other AC that was R22 gas or not energy efficient. Now, 2 years down the line, the supplier is knocking at our door and telling us, well, actually, we started to also sell these energy efficient models that you want. So we've helped to create a market for a more sustainable product. And I think that's in my opinion, the way to address this question. And really, we need to ask and demand certain things to suppliers and ask them to change and be more sustainable. Over.
Thank you very much. So we have time for, I think, it's a long question, but an important one. Also, around PPE, I'd refer you to some of the other webinars that have been recorded, and I think some of the waste management that were specifically addressed within those. And so just for those of you who had questions about that. But this last question, maybe we don't have a whole lot of time for the answer, I think, but probably for you, Mihir. Vulnerability refers to future and not present harm. This function must include a predictive model, but at the same time, how can we adopt through environmental vulnerability index in a better way? Is there any better adoptable models that are available presently? And that question, did you get that question okay?
Yes, I've thanked them. I'm not offhand aware of any model of sustainability or humanitarian action which includes environmental aspect as much as we would like to. There are some initiatives, and I'm saying it's not as much as we would like to because COVID-19 has changed everything about the humanitarian action, and we need to relook at what challenges it has posed to the humanitarian action. Having said that, the environmental index of vulnerability is something which is very important to be developed, and some of the areas where more work is being done is including, for example, not only of course, the solid waste management, as I said, the water, as I said before, but also the sanitization that is causing wide-scale cleaning up of large number of species that we can't see with our own eyes. And that's a lot of them are very useful for our well-being. Human life is dependent on a large number of species, not only animals, but large number of other species, and they are being wiped out. So what's the impact of COVID-19 medicine and precautions on them? And that's something which, how do we include that in the environmental vulnerability index to make it more comprehensive? That's an area where more work is being done and needs to be done, and then how to integrate with, of course, the aspects that so well the WFP described. I really thought was a very good presentation with many other UN agencies and maybe international NGOs and governments could pick it up to way of looking at how the whole supply chain, but also the whole action can be reviewed from the sustainability point of view. Very good, Emanuela, thank you.
All right, and that brings us to the end. Thank you very much, Victoria, Mihir, Emanuela, and Hussein. Hopefully we'll get to hear more from him in the future. And thank you all very much for attending this webinar. We wouldn't be running these without all of the attendees. So please join us for the sixth and conclusive webinar that will take place on the 16th of December, and really focusing on what we have learned from past emergencies and what the future outlook is. I think very much in line with a lot of these presentations. And with that, thank you. And don't forget those bees.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.